We've reached the end of week 6. Here we are at the end of the informative speech, and so I wanted to spend some more time returning back to our evaluation form just so that we all kind of have an agreement about what these terms mean, so that we come to some sort of community understanding about what it means to distinguish between excellent and adequate under one of these categories. So we're going to be looking at a couple of speeches that I had students do for me. Past couple of weeks we've been looking at TED Talks, and I think that's been great. It shows sort of the flexibility of the rubric, and it shows that we should be thinking about various forms of interacting with the informative speech. I do want to return to these speakers for our last round of informative speeches because they're illustrative in very particular ways. So what we're going to start with is Walker's speech on a market concept. I'll let him introduce it for you. And in essence, what he's doing is he's performing the sort of standard lecture, college lecture. And that's very helpful because a lot of us have to do that or do something like it. It's a very prototypical way of engaging in informative speaking. So I asked him to do this, and then after we watch the speech, I want to move through the evaluation form and talk perhaps about some of the dangers that we run into when we engage in this type of lecturing. So let's go ahead and take a look at Walker's speech now.
I'd like to spend a little time today talking with you about oligopolies, which is a market in which there are some arbitrarily small number of firms which dominate the market share. Now, they may not be the only firms in that particular market, but they would have something, some massive share of the market, like 80, 90, 70%, something like that. And specifically, what I'd like to talk today with you about in regards to oligopolies are, 1, how they should and do form naturally in competitive markets, 2, what various forms of oligopolies there are, what different models we can use to analyze them, and 3, the difference between an oligopoly and a cartel, which are often confused. But returning to my first main point is that oligopolies do indeed form naturally in competitive markets. They're not anti-free market in any way. And they do so for a variety of reasons, which I'd like to sort of rattle off right now. The first one are innovations. If there is some sort of new invention or piece of technology, there's naturally not going to be a ton of firms in that particular market. Think of like the very beginning of computing or internet technology. There were a small number of firms that just sort of dominated the landscape. So that's one way that oligopolies form naturally. Another way are when there's some sort of market or fundamental industry leadings or characteristics that naturally tend towards oligopolies. A couple examples of that could be maybe social networking sites or video games. Now, these products are actually, they increase in value the more people have them. They become objectively more valuable. And I say that because, Facebook only has value the more people that use it, and something like Xbox Live, it becomes a better experience the more people that are using it. So naturally, these sorts of markets tend towards these very, very large companies and tend to form oligopolies. Another canonical reason why oligopolies forms is if there's some sort of market entry barrier. A very good example of that is if there's an enormous fixed cost to entering that marketplace. If you want to invent or create a cable telecommunications or satellite television provider, you can't just willy-nilly get into that market. It involves an enormous upfront cost that makes it or discourages many, many companies and people from entering that market. Another potential barrier to market entry could be if there are legal restrictions or patent concerns. This happens a lot in pharmaceutical companies. It takes so much money to develop and hang on to these patents that they naturally are, these sort of industries are dominated by a very small number of firms. And then finally, and perhaps the most simple reason why oligopolies forms is just economies of scale. In the same way that it's cheaper for all of us to buy in bulk, go to Costco and get a 20-year supply of cranberry juice or something like that, in the same way, it becomes much cheaper per unit for these companies to produce and sell in bulk. So that is a very normal way that oligopolies tend to form. So for these general reasons, we can see that oligopolies are not anti-capitalistic, they're not anti-free market. They should and do happen naturally all the time. So my next main point I'd like to talk to you about is the various types of oligopolies there are and the ways we can analyze them. The first model that I'd like to talk with you about is when the firms set their price simultaneously. And this is a model that was developed by a guy named Bertrand. And let's, for simplicity's sake, imagine there's only two firms in this particular market, from 1 and 2. They set their price simultaneously based on what they think the other person is going to do. So if they're producing something for, let's say, $10, and firm 1 sets their price at 15, firm 2 sets it at 13, everyone's going to buy firm 2 because it's the exact same product, but it's cheaper. So to get any sort of sales, firm 1's going to have to undercut firm 2 to make some sales, but that means that everyone's buying firm 1's, and it just becomes this cycle of price cutting until neither firm has any incentive to deviate. And that's the point where the cost of producing equals the price they're selling at. And this is actually the exact same equilibrium point that a perfectly competitive marketplace would in fact produce. So in this way, there's really no difference to the society as a whole if this sort of oligopoly exists. It's the exact same output, which is actually something known as the Bertrand paradox. If you, I don't know, in your free time want to look up more about oligopolies. But the second model I'd like to talk today with you about is what if they set their quantity producing first simultaneously rather than setting their price simultaneously. So in this way, they have a profit maximizing function, which basically tells them, given what the other firm produces, this is what they should produce to maximize their profit. So the equilibrium point in this particular model, which is developed by a guy named Cours, is when these particular profit maximizing functions intersect, and that's where you get your equilibrium price and quantity. And in this particular oligopoly, there is a deadweight loss of society. They aren't producing the societal optimal amount. So in this way, it is, I guess, better for the society at whole if a Bertrand, or when they set the price simultaneously rather than setting the quantity simultaneously. But they do exist. A natural example of this is something like airline companies. They tend to set their prices, or set their quantity produced, not their prices. But then the final model of oligopoly I'd like to talk with you about is when exists a market where there's one dominant firm, and they set their price, and then everyone else sort of falls in line. So in this way, it is actually very much like a perfectly competitive market, except that instead of the market setting the price, it's this really dominant firm. It's hard to find actual examples of this in real life, but it is an interesting thing to think about. So as you can see, in all three of these models, they behave very differently, and it has various outputs for society as a whole. Now that we know why and how oligopolies exist, various types of oligopolies, I think it's becomes a little more clear the difference between an oligopoly and a cartel. Because a cartel is some sort of arbitrarily small number of firms in a market, but they're participating in active and explicit collusion. This is when there's the classic image of a smoke-filled room somewhere dark at night, and they're talking about fixing the prices and kind of, cheating the system. Now, while in the United States and most places around the world, this is highly regulated against, and they don't actually exist that often, there does exist first world examples that we can point to right now. OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, this is precisely a cartel. They do get together and fix their price, and they're actually producing, they're capping their production levels. They're not producing as much as they potentially could in order to keep the prices high. So this is an active example of a cartel, and a cartel, it's actually the output precisely the same as a monopoly. So it is potentially very bad for society as a whole. There's a huge deadweight loss, and really no one's having fun except for the people in the cartels. So in conclusion, we've seen how and why oligopolies exist in competitive markets, the various types and forms that oligopolies can take, and the difference between cartels and oligopolies. So I hope you know a little bit more about this, I think, fairly interesting aspect of economics, and perhaps you'll look more up at it in the future.